Listen carefully. Sometimes, not everyone who stretches out a hand for help truly needs it. Some are there only to take away something precious from you after you have helped them. Sad as it may sound, if you pay good attention to this story, you will understand that appearances can be deceiving, that not everyone who crosses your path comes with good intentions, and above all, you will learn how important it is to always pray before rendering help, because you may know your own heart, but in this world, you can never truly know the intentions of another person, especially toward you. You are now watching African Tales, where every story teaches an important lesson. Once upon a time, in the great busy city of Ibadan, a city of hills and red rooftops stretching as far as the eye could see, there lived a woman that nobody truly understood. Ibadan was a city that breathed life. The markets buzzed from dawn to dusk. Motorcycles wove through traffic like ants on a determined march. The smell of amala and uwedu soup drifted through the air every evening like a warm, welcome home. Children played in narrow streets. Traders called out their wares in voices that carried over the noise of engines and passing lorries. It was a city of people doing life together, loudly, passionately, faithfully. And right in the middle of all this life, sitting on the same corner near Mokola bus stop, every single day, year after year, was a woman people called Iya Alajo. Nobody knew her real name. Nobody knew where she came from or who her people were. People simply called her Iya Alajo, which loosely means the woman who collects. She had been on that corner so long that some people truly believed she had always been there, like an old tree at the roadside that nobody remembers planting, but everyone walks past. To look at her, your heart would break immediately. She was very thin, so thin that her bones showed beneath dark, wrinkled skin. Her clothes were torn and patched with pieces of cloth that did not match. She wore a faded headscarf that had once been white, but had long since surrendered to the color of dust and age. Her feet were bare, cracked, and covered in the red earth of Ibadan roads. She sat on a worn mat, her legs stretched out in front of her, her hands always held up to anyone who passed. Her body spoke of suffering. Her posture spoke of defeat. Everything about her screamed, "Help me!" But her eyes were the one thing that was different. Deep, dark eyes. Some people said they looked sad and tired, the eyes of a woman who had known nothing but hardship. But others, when they thought about it carefully later, much later, said those eyes were always watching, calculating, studying the person who gave, the amount they gave, the way they gave it. Not the eyes of a woman who was suffering, the eyes of someone who was working. But in those days, nobody noticed that. Because when you see someone that poor sitting on the ground, you do not study their eyes. You feel pity. You reach into your pocket, you give what you can. And that moment of human kindness, that brief, beautiful instinct to help, was exactly what she had been counting on. The first victim people clearly remembered was Baba Remy. Baba Remy was a provisions trader at Bodija Market, a good man, a hard-working man who had spent 10 years building his shop from nothing. He started with a small wooden table, selling sugar and salt in small nylon bags. Over the years, he grew it, 2 working freezers, shelves full of goods, canned tomatoes, rice, cooking oil, soap, biscuits, a generator he had bought on credit, and finally, painstakingly, finished paying off. Baba Remy was not rich, but he had built something solid with his own hands, something he was proud of, something his family depended on. One morning, passing Mokola bus stop on his way to open his shop, he saw Iya Alajo, the cracked feet, the thin arms, the torn clothes, the outstretched hand. Something in his chest moved. He was a man who believed in helping others. His mother had taught him that a hand that gives never lacks. He reached into his pocket and placed 200 naira in her outstretched hand. She looked up at him. Those dark eyes held his for a moment longer than felt comfortable. No thank you, no smile, no nod of gratitude, just a long, cold look, as though she were reading something written on his soul that he himself could not see. And then she turned away, as if he had ceased to exist. Baba Remy walked on, feeling the small, warm satisfaction that comes when you help someone. He did not think about the look she gave him. Why would he? He had done a good thing. He went to his shop, opened for the day, and life continued. 3 months later, his shop was empty. It happened piece by piece, the way a wall crumbles before it finally falls. First, one freezer broke down. The repairman said the compressor was gone. The cost of replacing it was more than he had. He borrowed. Then a trusted supplier, a man he had done business with for years, cheated him, took payment for goods he never delivered and disappeared. Then his remaining stock began spoiling because the second freezer also developed a fault. Then his customers, one by one, started going elsewhere. Not all at once, slowly, quietly, like water draining from a basin with a crack you cannot find. A man who had worked 10 years to build something solid was sitting in an empty shop, completely lost and completely confused. He could not understand what had happened. He had done everything right. He had been honest, hard-working, faithful. And yet everything had collapsed in 3 months, as if an invisible hand had reached in and dismantled his life piece by piece. He never connected it to the 200 naira. Why would he? Then came the story of Mama Tandi. Mama Tandi was 7 months pregnant, returning home from her antenatal checkup. The doctors had said everything was perfect. The baby was healthy, the heartbeat was strong, the weight was good, she was glowing, she was almost floating with happiness as she walked through Mokola, one hand on her back, the other holding her hospital papers. She saw Iya Alajo on the corner, felt a rush of compassion, a mother's heart feeling for another woman who clearly had nothing. She reached into her purse and placed 500 naira, nearly all the cash she had on her that day, gently in the old woman's hand. Those dark eyes looked up, the same cold, calculating look. No warmth, no gratitude, just watching, just taking in something invisible from the exchange. Mama Tandi smiled at her and walked on, praying silently for the old woman. 2 weeks later, Mama Tandi lost her baby. She went into labor unexpectedly. The hospital rushed to help her, but the baby was already gone. The doctors could not explain it. Everything had been perfect 2 weeks earlier. The heartbeat had been strong. There was no infection, no complication, no reason. Just like that. Gone. When Mama Tandi's sister began asking questions around the neighborhood, trying to make sense of the tragedy, she found not 1, not 2, but 3 other women who had lost pregnancies after giving money to the old beggar at that corner. The whispers began, quietly, nervously, afraid of being called superstitious, afraid of being labeled backward or uneducated. But the whispers began, and they spread. Over the years that followed, more stories came. And a very clear, very frightening pattern took shape. There was Kunle, a young man who had just received a job offer from a big company in Lagos. The job he had prayed and waited years for. The interview had been difficult. He had beaten out dozens of candidates. The offer letter was in his hand. His future was finally opening up. On his way to make preparations for his move to Lagos, he passed Iya Alajo at Mokola bus stop. Without thinking twice, he gave her 100 naira, a small thing, a moment of kindness on a happy day. 3 days later, the company called. Budget review. The position had been cancelled, just like that. The future he had counted on, planned for, celebrated, gone. He sat in his room for 3 days without eating, staring at the offer letter that no longer meant anything. Then came Mrs. Adetinuke, a fabric seller at Oje Market, with loyal customers and a steady, reliable business. She gave Iya Alajo money on a Thursday afternoon. By the following Monday, her biggest customer, a woman who bought fabric in large quantities to resell in a neighboring town, Called to say she was changing suppliers. No explanation, no argument, no opportunity to negotiate. Just gone. Mrs. Adetinuk lost nearly half her monthly income in a matter of days. There was a student named Bode waiting on his WAEC results that would determine whether he could enter university. He had studied hard. His teachers believed in him. His family had sacrificed to pay his school fees. On his way to check his scores, he passed Mokola, saw the old woman, and gave her some money. His results were a complete disaster. He failed subjects he was absolutely certain he had answered correctly, subjects his teachers had predicted he would ace. The scores did not match his ability, his preparation, or his performance. It was as if someone had reached into the system and scrambled his results. Businesses collapsing, pregnancies ending in grief, job offers disappearing, examination results destroyed. And always, just before the disaster, the same act of kindness given to the same thin old woman at Mokola bus stop. But here is the painful part. Even with all the whispers, people still kept giving her money. Because she always looked so genuinely pitiful. Because the disaster did not always follow immediately. Sometimes it came 2 weeks later, sometimes a month, sometimes longer. The gap between the giving and the destruction was just wide enough for people to tell themselves it was coincidence. They told themselves, "I am a person of faith. I do not believe in such things." They told themselves, "She is just an old beggar. What harm can she do?" They told themselves, "Bad things happen to everyone. It is part of life." And so they gave, and so they suffered, and she sat on her mat every single day, collecting not just their money, but their blessings, their open doors, their opportunities, and the futures they had worked so hard to build. What nobody in Mokola ever saw was what happened when Iya Alajo went home at night. Every evening, around 6 o'clock, as the Ibadan sky turned from blue to orange to the deep purple of approaching night, she would quietly fold her mat, tuck it under her arm, and disappear into the narrow streets behind Mokola. She moved through those streets quickly, speaking to no one. People in that area did not greet her, not because they did not know her, but because something about her made people look away. An instinct. A prickle at the back of the neck, the body recognizing something the mind refused to accept. She lived alone in a small walled compound tucked behind a row of houses. A few people had caught accidental glimpses of her there over the years. A neighbor who once looked through a gap in the fence, a child who wandered too close one evening before his mother snatched him away. They all told the same story in lowered voices, as if speaking about it too loudly might bring it to their own doorstep. At night, she did not look like a suffering old woman. Her back was straight, her steps were firm and confident. She moved through her compound with the ease of someone completely at home in the dark. She would sit in the center of the courtyard and lay out all the money she had collected that day. Every coin, every note, carefully arranged in front of her. Then she would begin, movements nobody could properly name, hands passing over the money in patterns that followed no human rhythm, words spoken into the night air in a voice too low to hear but somehow too heavy to ignore. A smell rising, like something burning with no visible fire, like herbs and charcoal and something older, something that had no name in any living language. She would hold each piece of money, turn it over in her fingers, speak over it, breathe on it, and the air around her would thicken and shift, even on the stillest nights when no breeze was blowing and the trees stood perfectly still. This was the true transaction. Not money for money, not begging for survival. This was blessing for blessing, grace for grace, life for life. She was not keeping the naira for herself. She was using it as a vessel, because every coin a good-hearted person pressed into her palm carried with it something invisible. That person's goodwill, their grace, their faith, the pure energy of their kindness. and she knew how to pull that invisible thing out of the coin and redirect it, away from the giver, into darkness. She was stealing their blessings and feeding them to whatever dark force sustained her. In the morning, she would put her torn clothes back on, wrap her old headscarf around her head, pick up her mat, and walk back to her corner. Looking every inch the helpless old woman that Ibadan had always known, ready to begin again, ready to collect, for years, hundreds of ruined lives, and never once caught. Until one ordinary Tuesday morning changed everything. His name was Adefolarin Deji, but everyone called him Deji. Deji was 32 years old. He worked as a technician at a small electronics repair shop near Dugby Market, fixing phones and appliances for people who could not afford to buy new ones. He was not rich, not powerful, not well connected, just an ordinary young man doing his honest best in Ibadan, earning his daily bread with his hands and his skill. But Deji had one thing that set him apart. Not talent, not luck, not connections. A habit, a simple, daily, unbroken habit. Every morning before leaving his house, he prayed, not long, dramatic prayers, not prayers that needed an audience or a platform, just quiet, personal words spoken in the privacy of his room before the day began. Lord, go with me today. Cover everything I touch. Let nothing evil attach itself to me or to what I do. Order my steps. And this habit did not stop at morning. Before he made any decision, big or small, he would pause briefly and bring God into that moment. Before eating, before signing anything, before accepting anything from anyone, before stepping into any space, he covered it. It was not religious performance. It was simply who he was, as natural as breathing. That Tuesday, walking his usual route through Mokola to work, he saw Iya Alajo on her mat. He had heard fragments of the whispers surrounding her name, vague stories about people losing things after giving her money. But like many people, he was not entirely sure what to believe. He was a practical man. He did not jump at shadows. What moved him that morning was simply what he saw with his eyes. Feet cracked and bleeding at the heel. The hollow look of someone who had not eaten since the day before. The trembling hand stretched out in silent appeal. His heart responded. He reached into his pocket and brought out 100 naira. Then he paused, not from fear, not from hesitation, simply because it was his habit. Before anything that mattered, he covered it in prayer. Quietly in his heart, he said, Lord, I am giving this from a good heart. Let this kindness be blessed and not cursed. Let no evil attach itself to what I do right now. I give in your name. Cover me with your grace. Just those few words, silent, invisible, unnoticed by anyone around him. He placed the money in her hand and walked on. She looked up. Those dark, calculating eyes found his face, and she tried to do what she had done to hundreds of people before him. She reached out, not in the physical, but in the spirit, to take the blessing, the grace, the goodwill he had carried in that act of giving. She hit a wall. Something solid and immovable surrounded this man, a covering her darkness could not cross, a barrier she had never encountered in 20 years of collecting. She pushed, and the force came straight back at her, like a wave crashing against rock, like sunlight burning into shadow. She could not take a single thing from him, not one thread of blessing, not one particle of grace. The covering was complete. Deji noticed nothing unusual. He walked on toward Dugbe, thinking about his workday, the phones waiting to be repaired, the customer who was coming at noon. He had simply prayed and given, as he always did. But Iya Alajo sat very still for a long time after he disappeared into the crowd. Something that had never happened before had just happened. The flow she had depended on for 20 years, the easy, effortless siphoning of blessings from kind-hearted strangers, had been blocked by one ordinary man and one quiet prayer, and deep inside her, something cracked. Weeks passed. Deji lived his ordinary life. His work was steady, His health was good. Small, good things happened quietly around him. A repair job that paid a little more than expected. His rent money ready earlier than usual. A general sense of things going right, of doors opening instead of closing. He did not connect any of this to the old woman at Mokola. He had simply prayed and given, as he always did. It was not an event for him. It was a Tuesday. But someone was watching. CCB sold pepper and tomatoes from a stall near Mokola. She was the kind of woman who noticed small details that others walked past. The way a customer's eyes shifted when they were lying. The way a child's cry changed when it was real versus when it was performance. She had lived in Mokola long enough to have seen things, heard things, survived things that had taught her to pay attention. She had seen Deji that Tuesday morning, seen him pause, seen him bow his head slightly, just for a second, before placing the money in the old woman's hand. She had noticed it because it was different. Most people reached into their pockets and dropped money without a thought. This young man had paused, had covered the moment with something invisible before his hand moved. She knew the stories. She knew about Baba Remy and Mama Tundi and many others. She knew the pattern, give to the old woman then lose something. So she waited. 6 weeks passed. She watched Deji come and go through Mokola every day. She watched his face. She watched his step. She watched for the signs of a man whose life was quietly unraveling. There were none. If anything, he looked lighter, more settled. Things were moving well for him. 6 weeks later, she found a moment to speak with Deji as he passed her stall. She asked casually, with the practiced ease of a market woman who knows how to ask real questions without alarming anyone. "Deji, how are things? Work is fine?" He smiled. "Fine, thanks be to God. Things are moving well?" Sisibi nodded, smiled back, and let him go. She went back to her stall and sat quietly with her own thoughts for a long time. The pepper and tomatoes sat in their baskets, and the market moved around her, and she thought about what she had seen and what she had not seen. Then she began to talk, first to the woman at the next stall, then to her neighbor, then to another trader she trusted. She told them what she had observed, the pause, the prayer, and the fact that 6 weeks later, this young man was untouched, unharmed, moving forward while others had crumbled. Her neighbor told her pastor, a man who did not dismiss things easily, a man who had seen enough of life to know that the world contains things that simple words cannot explain, and that prayer is not a ritual, but a shield. He came to Mokola one Saturday morning and stood at a distance, watching Iya Alajo carefully. He watched the way her eyes moved when someone gave, the way her lips tightened ever so slightly around each coin before she let it fall into the small pile beside her, the way the air seemed to shift around her in subtle, almost unnoticeable ways. He gathered a small group of trusted people right there on the street, and they prayed together softly, heads bowed, voices barely above a whisper, barely noticeable in the crowd of a Saturday morning market, and something in the atmosphere over Mokola began to shift. It happened on a Friday morning, a busy, noisy, ordinary Friday. A man named Mr. Ario, a civil servant who passed through Mokola each Friday on his way to work, had decided that today he would finally give the old beggar some money. Something had always made him hold back before, a feeling he could not name, a hesitation in his spirit that he had learned over the years not to ignore. But today he felt generous. The month had been good. His salary had come early. He reached into his pocket and began counting out some notes. Then a small boy appeared, no more than 5 years old, a child who had slipped from his mother's hand for just a moment in the crowd. He wandered directly in front of Iya Alajo. He looked down at the old woman on her mat, and he began to scream. Not the crying of a lost or hungry child, not the tantrum of a child denied a toy. This was deep, body shaking, terrified screaming, the kind that comes from seeing something that adults have learned to ignore, the kind that comes from a child's eyes seeing what adult eyes have been trained to filter out. He pointed at her with a trembling finger and could not stop. His mother came running, scooped him up, and for the first time truly looked at the old woman. Not with a hurried glance, not with the automatic pity of a passing stranger. She really looked, and she felt something cold move through her body that she could not name, a chill that started at the top of her head and ran down to her feet. She backed away quickly, holding her son tightly against her chest, and kept walking without a word. Mr. Arillo put his money back in his pocket and walked away fast. Then Fumi, the jewelry seller nearby, suddenly remembered something. 3 years ago, she had given Iya Alajo money. And that very same week, her best customer had stopped buying from her. Her sales had collapsed. She had struggled for months to recover. She had never once connected the two events, not once in 3 years, until now. She opened her mouth, and the words came out, first to the woman beside her, then louder, because truth has a way of getting louder once it starts moving. More voices joined, a trader who had lost a contract, a mother who had lost a child, a young man who remembered his brother's story, the job in Lagos that vanished 3 days after giving the old woman 100 naira. The crowd thickened, and then Pa Adisa stepped forward. Pa Adisa was 80 years old, 40 years in Mokola, a man whose words people waited for before they decided what to believe, a man who had seen Iya Alajo arrive on that corner 20 years ago and had watched her, season after season, year after year, with the quiet patience of someone who knows that truth eventually reveals itself. He stood straight, despite his age, and spoke clearly. I have watched this woman since 1998. I have seen what she does. I have seen the people who give to her and what happens to them afterward. I said nothing because I was afraid. Afraid of being called a superstitious old man. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of what it would mean if I was right. But I am 80 years old, and I do not have time left to be afraid. I am telling you today, this woman is not what she appears to be. She is a destroyer. The crowd erupted. Years of quiet suffering, years of whispered suspicion, years of telling themselves it was coincidence, it was bad luck, it was life being unfair. It all poured out at once, voices overlapping, hands raised, tears falling, people pointing at the woman on the mat, demanding answers, demanding acknowledgement, demanding an end to the pretending. And then, in the middle of all that noise, something happened that silenced everyone. Iya Alajo's face changed. Not the way a face changes with emotion, not embarrassment, not fear, not shame. Deeper than that. The mask of suffering she had worn for 20 years, the thinness, the weakness, the helplessness, slipped, just for a few seconds, like a veil caught by a sudden wind, and what showed underneath was something cold and composed, something that had never once truly suffered, something that had, for a very long time, been perfectly satisfied with itself and its work. The eyes that had looked sad and tired to so many people now looked flat and empty and dangerous, the face of a predator that had been accidentally revealed in daylight. People nearest to her stepped back. Some turned and ran. Others dropped to their knees and began to pray aloud. For the first time in 20 years, Iya Alajo was fully and completely seen. In the days and weeks that followed the exposure at Mokola, something quietly wonderful spread across Ibadan. Those who had been destroyed by Iya Alajo began to bounce back. Baba Remy, who had lost his shop and spent years struggling, borrowing money, living with the quiet shame of a man who once had something and lost it, received a visit from a new supplier. A man he had never met, who offered him full stock on generous credit terms, no questions asked, just a business opportunity that appeared from nowhere, the way good things sometimes do when the air clears. Baba Remy reopened his shop. Within months, it was fuller and busier than it had ever been, even in his best days before the destruction. He would stand in the doorway of his shop some evenings, looking at the shelves, and shake his head in quiet wonder. What the enemy had taken, Grace had restored, and then some. Mama Tunde, who had lost 3 pregnancies and cried more tears than she believed a human body could produce, became pregnant again. This time, the doctors were amazed at how strong everything was from the very first checkup. The heartbeat was perfect, the weight was perfect. She carried that pregnancy all 9 months without a single complication and delivered a healthy, beautiful baby girl. She named the child Grace. Kunle received a call from a different company in Lagos. A better company, higher salary, more senior position, better benefits. He took it and never looked back. The job he had lost turned out to be a stepping stone to something greater. He just had not been able to see it while the path was blocked. Mrs. Adetinuke's fabric business recovered steadily, her customers returning one by one, new ones finding her through word of mouth. Within a year, her business was larger than it had been before the collapse. Bode retook his WAEC examinations and passed with grades so high that his school held him up as an example for younger students. The same subjects he had failed before, he now aced. The same brain that had been blocked now flowed freely. Not every recovery was instant. For some, it took months of patient, hard-working faith before things truly turned around. Old habits of fear and loss had to be unlearned. New foundations had to be laid, but the direction had changed. And that change in direction was everything. It was as if a heavy stone had been lifted from the mouth of a well, and the water that had always been there could finally rise freely to the surface. People said it was the grace of God, and they were right. When darkness is exposed and removed, the light it was suppressing has room to live again. The blessings had always been there. They had simply been blocked, redirected, stolen. Now the blockage was gone, and life rushed back in to fill the space. When people tried to celebrate Deji as a hero, he would look uncomfortable and shake his head. He kept saying, "I did not do anything special. I just did what I always do. I gave with God's name on it. That is all." And that slowly was what Ibadan came to understand as the whole lesson. It was never about being special. It was never about having some extraordinary spiritual gift or power. It was about being consistent, about covering even the smallest, most ordinary moments with prayer, a habit so quiet it seemed like nothing, until the day it became everything. The community did not go to the police. They did not take the matter to any court. What Iya Alajo had done could not be handled in an ordinary courtroom. The damage had been done in the spirit, even though its consequences were felt very much in the flesh, in empty shops, and lost babies, and cancelled job offers, and failed exams. No law on earth covered such crimes. This was a matter for the community itself. So they gathered, as Ibadan people know how to do. Elders, pastors, imams, community leaders met and reached the same conclusion without much argument. Iya Alajo could no longer live among them. A public meeting was held on a Saturday morning at the open space near the bus stop, the very spot where she had sat for over 2 decades. Hundreds gathered. The air was heavy but clear. She came without being dragged. She knew the game was over. The mask had slipped, and everyone had seen what was underneath. There was nowhere left to hide. One by one, people stood and spoke. Baba Remy described watching 10 years of work disappear in 3 months. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the effort of finally saying aloud what he had carried in silence for years. Mama Tundi stood before the gathering with her baby daughter, little Grace, tied to her back. In a calm, clear voice, she described 3 pregnancies lost. 3 times hope had been given and taken away. 3 times she had asked God why, and now she knew. Kunle came down from Lagos to speak. He described the phone call that cancelled his future and the 3 days he spent without eating afterward, staring at an offer letter that no longer mattered. Fumi spoke. Students spoke. Traders spoke. Mothers spoke. Fathers spoke. They testified for over 2 hours. And the weight of all those stories together, the accumulated grief, the accumulated loss, the accumulated realization, was enormous. It pressed down on that gathering like a physical force. Iya Alajo sat in the center of it all and said nothing. Her dark eyes were flat and empty now, like a fire that had gone completely cold. The power that had lived behind those eyes for 20 years was gone, broken first by one young man's quiet prayer, drained further by truth spoken openly and without fear, and finished entirely by a whole community standing together and refusing to be afraid any longer. When the last person sat down, Pa Adisa rose slowly to his feet. The crowd went silent. He looked at Iya Alajo for a long moment. Then he spoke the final word of judgment in a voice as steady as old wood. You are not welcome here. You came among us and took from people who gave you kindness. You took their businesses, their children, their futures. You turned mercy into a weapon. There is no longer any place for you in this city. Go, and do not come back. 2 young men from the community escorted her out of Mokola that same day. She went. Some said they saw her near Oyo on the edge of the city. Others said towards Oshogbo. But she left Ibadan and never returned. Without the community she had fed on for so long, she had nothing. The darkness that had powered her was broken. And wherever she went now, whatever market she sat in front of, whatever bus station she tried, people walked past without stopping, without looking, without giving. It was as if an invisible mark had been placed on her that strangers could sense without understanding. Even people who had never heard her story would feel a strange unease and quicken their steps as they passed her. She moved from place to place, growing genuinely thin now, genuinely hungry, genuinely alone. She had no family, no friendships built on anything real, no life outside the darkness she had chosen decades ago, and the darkness was gone. About 2 years after leaving Ibadan, a woman in a small town outside the city said she saw her sitting at a roadside. She looked empty, the woman said quietly, like a lamp that had completely run out of oil. 3 years after the banishment, word came back to Mokola through quiet channels, the way serious news always travels, that Iya Alajo was dead. Nobody could say exactly where or exactly how. No funeral that anyone attended, no grave that anyone could point to. She slipped out of the world as quietly and as anonymously as she had once sat on her mat watching the people of Ibadan pass by. Nobody mourned her. But when the news reached Mokola, people felt something. Not happiness, not triumph, but the deep, quiet relief of a long and grey season finally coming to an end. The feeling of a window opened after years in a closed room. Something heavy had lifted from the air. Ibadan could breathe again. Years passed. Ibadan moved on, as great and living cities always do. The market stayed noisy. The motorcycles kept weaving. The smell of amala kept rising in the evenings. New children were born. New traders set up their shops. New young people arrived with new dreams and new ambitions. Life moved forward as it must. But the story of Iya Alajo, the beggar of Ibadan, did not die with her. Mothers told it to their daughters while braiding their hair in the evenings. Fathers told it to their sons over meals. Traders passed it to younger traders just finding their feet in the market. It moved from mouth to ear, from one generation to the next, kept alive because the lesson it carried was too important to let go. And every person who told the story was always careful to say the same thing first. Do not stop helping the poor. That was not the lesson. Not even close. The poor must be helped. Kindness must never die in a person's heart. A generous heart is a blessed heart. The world desperately needs people who still give, who still reach out, who still see the suffering of others and respond with compassion. If the story of Iya Alajo makes you stop giving, then she has won one last victory from the grave. The lesson, the real lesson, was about how you give. It was about what you carry in your heart when your hand reaches out, because a gift given carelessly without faith, without covering, can be intercepted, can be turned, can be used as a channel to drain the very thing that made you generous in the first place. But a gift attached to prayer, a gift given with God's name on it, is protected. No darkness can reach what grace has already covered. When people asked CCB what had made Deji different from all the others, why the old woman could not touch him when she had touched so many, CCB would stop what she was doing, put down whatever was in her hands, and give the question the full answer it deserved. It was not that Deji was more powerful, she would say. It was not that he prayed longer prayers or was a more important person in the eyes of men. He had a habit he never broke. Not even for a small, ordinary Tuesday morning moment on his way to work. He covered everything with prayer, everything, even 100 naira. And that covering was the wall she could not cross. And when she hit that wall, something broke in her that had never broken before. That one ordinary man's quiet, consistent habit started the end of 20 years of darkness. The businesses of those who had been ruined kept growing, year by year, steadily. The children born to the women who had suffered kept coming into the world healthy and full of life. The opportunities that had been stolen came back in new and sometimes even better forms. And from all of it, Ibadan carried 3 truths forward. 3 truths that Iya Alajo herself, without ever intending to, had proven with her own life and death. The first truth: not everything that looks broken on the outside is broken on the inside. A pitiful appearance is not always the whole story. The most dangerous things in this world do not always come dressed in threat. Sometimes they come dressed in need, in weakness, in helplessness. Ask God for discernment, the wisdom to see what the eye alone cannot show you. The eye sees the cracked feet. Discernment sees the calculating eyes behind the mask. The second truth: evil cannot hide forever. It may operate for a long season, longer than seems fair, longer than seems bearable. 20 years Iya Alajo sat on that corner. 20 years she took from people who showed her kindness. But the light always comes. Truth always finds its way to the surface. No darkness in this world can build a permanent home. The exposure always comes. Sometimes through a praying young man, sometimes through a market woman who pays attention, sometimes through a 5-year-old child who sees what adults have learned to ignore. But it comes. The third and greatest truth: give, always give. Let your heart remain generous and open. Never let the cruelty of one person close the door of your compassion. But cover your giving with prayer. Attach God's name to every act of kindness that leaves your hands, no matter how small, no matter how ordinary the moment feels. Whether it is 100 naira or 1,000 naira, whether it is a coin or a kind word or a helping hand, cover it. Because a covered kindness is not just a kind act, it is a powerful act, and no force of darkness that exists in this world or the next can lay a finger on what grace has already covered. If you passed through Mokola today and stopped at the old corner near the bus stop, you would see nothing unusual, just the road and the traffic and the people moving with their loads and their dreams. The motorcycles would still weave, the traders would still call out, life would still be loud and busy and full. But sometimes, if you stood there long enough, you might notice an older resident pause at that particular spot. They would look for a quiet moment at the empty ground where a worn mat once lay. They would shake their heads slowly, almost to themselves, as if remembering something both painful and profoundly instructive. And then they would walk on, with something that looked almost like gratitude written across their face. Some things a city does not forget. Some lessons stay in a place the way a scar stays on the skin, always visible to those who know where to look. A mark of something survived, a reminder of how far grace can reach and how much one praying heart can change. The beggar of Ibadan was gone, and the people of Ibadan were free. This has been African Tales by Sam, where every story teaches an important lesson. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss a story. And remember, keep your heart generous, keep your giving covered, and let prayer go before you in everything you do. Until next time, stay blessed. Stay.